And excuse me, with that bodhicitta in mind, we'll do the verse of refuge and bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, through the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So we left off, we kind of started to cover page 13, but I think we'll just pick up there again. But, so we're in this section, we're talking about like, what was it? Inferential cognition, right? And valid cognition. And then we're going to, get into a bunch of details about that. But actually, I'm going to start. I wasn't planning this, but I think I will. I just want to start with a couple minutes of, I say this right way, like to reflect just for a minute together on how this relates to Dharma practice, right? Because I think it'd be easy to like, it's philosophical. It's like philosophical material, right? Actually, maybe I'll say it that way. It's philosophical material, and if you're not raised in Buddhist context, right? In other words, if you're Buddhist and you're raised in a Buddhist context, then you know that the study of philosophy is directly related to working on your own mind, right? In other words, that the whole purpose of philosophy is to progress towards enlightenment. And from a Buddhist, so in other words, if you're raised in a Buddhist context, then it's like obvious that there's no reason in the world to study philosophy unless it's to become enlightened. And I guess one thing that strikes me is like, I remember in high school, I took my first class in philosophy. I went to like a summer program, and that wasn't the assumption, right? It was actually, I took a summer, it was in high school, I took a summer, I was in New York, so I took a summer program at Columbia University, and it was like a summer class. And there was no assumption that was for enlightenment. Because that's not the assumption culturally. And so I guess I just want to warn us like that it's important to always come back to, we're studying this to work. Like when you're studying valid cognition, you're studying your own mind. Does that make sense? And so you have to keep bringing this back to, how is this relating to how I cause suffering or the lack of suffering in myself and others? And I just want to remind us of that. There's no other reason to study this than that, right? And what this is getting at, these teachings, are how your mind works, how my mind works, and how we perceive things. And it's not getting at that for any reason other than that the mind is the source of suffering and the mind is the source of happiness, right? And so if you don't understand how your mind works, then you don't know how to free yourself from suffering. And I'll just share again, like I was sort of reflecting on that, because I was getting, just as I always prepare for these classes and read some commentaries, and sometimes like when I was reading the commentaries, I was getting caught up in like, okay, what are they actually getting at here? There's like, it's intellectually challenging, certain parts of it. And it's easy to lose track of that. But then if you come back, it's like, oh my goodness, it's like, I'll just share, there are many reflections, but actually if you really look carefully, right? One point is, how do you cause yourself suffering, right? And if you check, it's not through valid cognition, right? In other words, valid cognizers aren't the cause of your suffering. Right? I was reflecting on this, like most of our lives, we live in these like cognitions, right? And actually, I'll share it. Actually, this is the way it struck me. Actually, I'll just share this part and then I'll stop and get back to the material. But um, actually, in Professor Jan Willis has a book, Enlightened Beings, which is the lives of the 80 of not the 84, the lives of certain Gelugpa Mahasiddhas, right? Gelugpa lamas who achieved enlightenment in that lifetime. And one thing I noticed when I read it years ago, and they're all like are holders of the these particular lamas were like holders of the secret oral. Oh, it's not secret. It's the secret miraculous volume that Manjushri gave to Lama Tsongkhapa. So they're mystics, right? They're mystical lamas who could read a book that doesn't exist in paper, right? That exists in some celestial way, and they're very mystical lamas. But one thing it said in that every one of them, I noticed, they would describe certain things when they received that volume, when they practiced chakra samvara, when they practiced the tantra, Vajrabhairava, when they practiced the tantra, Guhya Samaja. And then it was saying when they studied pramana. And I was like, these are mystics. Why is it emphasizing when they studied pramana? And what I think was the implicit meaning there is, if you want to achieve enlightenment, you have to study pramana. I was like, wow, that's amazing. Like it's not, that it's and then this was the way it struck me though. There's this teaching that if you want to be a yogi, right, if you want to be a great practitioner, you have to give up in the affairs of this life. And I often thought, what does that mean? Give up on the affairs of this life. And sometimes like lamas will say, it doesn't mean to go off to a cave, because somebody could go off to a cave and think, I actually have known people like this, right? You go off to a cave and you think, aren't I great? I'm off in a cave. Doesn't everybody think people should think I'm a great yogi? That's not giving up on the affairs of this life, right? It doesn't mean, and Lama Zopa often says this, it doesn't, like you could be giving up on the affairs of life is not an external thing. And then what struck me yesterday or this morning too, when I was thinking about this material, is giving up, like I was thinking about lamas I know, and I was like, oh wow, giving up on the affairs of this life means you're not living in mental projections about this life, right? Like that you're living in only actually like, so it's that you live in valid cognition, right? So valid cognizers. And then there are skillful methods that are not valid cognizers, right? That are for the purpose of becoming enlightened. So like if you're visualizing Tara sending light rays to all sentient beings, that's not a valid cognizer if you're an ordinary person, because you can't see Tara, right? But it's a skillful method for cultivating compassion and wisdom. Or if you're meditating, there are sometimes where in Lamrim where you meditate on valid cognizers, like impermanence, for example. You could achieve a valid cognition of impermanence. But if you meditate that if I meditate that in a past life, Frank was my mother, I'm not going to have a valid cognizer of that myself, but necessarily. But it's a skillful method for cultivating love, right, and gratitude. So there are certain methods that are skillful methods, right? And what struck me is like one way of describing a difference between someone like me and a great lama is we live, or those ordinary people, right, live in projections about this life, right? Whereas like a person who's a real Dharma practitioner doesn't. Right? They live in valid cognition and skillful methods, and everything else is irrelevant. All the other speculations about how do people perceive me, what's going to happen next, how is the, whatever, like just think of like lately, this past few weeks, right? How much have people been thinking about, things you can't have valid cognition about and are not skillful methods, right? If you're thinking about like, so in other words, like if you're thinking what the hell is wrong with Putin, that's like you haven't given up on this life, right? If you're thinking what's going to happen because of sanctions, or what's going to happen because of the war, or what's going to happen because of this, what's going to happen because of that, right? That's not valid cognition. It's not skillful methods for becoming enlightened, right? So like, and I was thinking that's the difference, right? If you ask, like, if you went to Gyume Khenpo Rinpoche and said something about the war, what he would do is pray for beings, or if he could donate money, he would donate money, and that's that, right? He wouldn't speculate beyond that. And I'm just reflecting on like, that's valid cognition, right? In other words, he stays with, lamas, people who are actually practicing Dharma, stay with what they could validly cognize or skillful methods to develop good qualities in themselves and others. And I was like, how much time? I'm just sharing this because to me, that's why we're studying this, is to reflect. This is what I was reflecting on. I'm inviting you to say, if you want, how much time do you spend on valid cognition or skillful methods for cultivating love and compassion and wisdom in your own mind? And then how much of your time is spent on other things, right? Like, what would it be like if what will so-and-so say? What will happen if I do this? And I'm just pointing out, like, I'm not saying don't ask those questions. I'm just saying reflect on, in 24 hours, what are you using your mind for? Right? And that's what this is getting at, right? This is getting at how do we use our minds. Yeah. Anyway, and then it's very disturbing if you think of like how many times you interact with other people based on things that are, and we're going to get into this later today, where it's like, what's the actual data you have, and then what's your story about that data, right? And how much of our time and our interaction is based on our story about data, and then we create so much suffering for ourselves and others, and oftentimes our stories are wrong, which is they're not valid cognitions, right? So they're often wrong. And then we can live our whole lives, or hours and days and months and years of our lives interacting with people based on stories about data that are not even accurate. And what the Pramana teachings are saying is, don't do that or you waste your precious human life, right? That's an implicit message here. So anyway, I wanted to say all that because it's like, we're not just studying this like for, it's not like some intellectual pursuit to prove that we're smart, or to, I don't know, something, whatever that would be. But okay, so I'll just review very briefly. I don't want to spend too long on it, but very briefly, like, so last time we covered, so this is like about inferential cognition, right? Inference for oneself and inference for another is the section here. So, and then we talked about, oops, go back. So inference for oneself and inferential cognizers are synonyms. And then inference for another and correct proof statement are synonyms. So in this context, by the way, inference for another doesn't necessarily mean another person. It could mean a future moment of yourself too. Like, so in other words, where you've not yet had an inference, but you're going to present a reason in order to help yourself realize something. So, and then we said here, so a sign is the reason, right? The reason is reasoning. So it says the definition of something's being a mind apprehending a sign in the proof that sound is impermanent is by the sign product. So again, I'm just reminding people what I said last time. So sign means the reason, and reason is, so this is for about inferential cognition, and it means that it's like, how does somebody gain an inferential cognition? They do so through the use of unerring reasoning. And then this, I personally love this sentence, this idea here. It says that it is a knower in the continuum of this phrase, a fully fledged other party. I just want to remind you, so like fully fledged, right? Like a bird, when a bird's fully fledged, it's ready to fly, right? So the idea here is that a correct reason requires a fully fledged person, meaning somebody who's ready to realize the thing, right? And so it's just a fascinating point. Presenting the correct reason to the wrong person, and sometimes the wrong person is me. That's what each of us has to recognize. Sometimes there's a correct reason, but I'm not yet the right person to realize the reason, because I don't have, and this is going to explain why, right? Because I don't have the certain recognitions, and it's just to give a simple example, right? If somebody were to present, if somebody were to present me right now with a perfectly well-defined reason from calculus, the reason could be quite correct. Like if a professor came to me and said, here's the reason proving this, and it was a reasoning from calculus, their reason could be totally correct, but I'm not a fully fledged person because I looked at calculus and I wouldn't know what they're talking about, right? So the reason can be correct, but I'm not a fully fledged person, so the reason wouldn't induce an inferential cognition. I would just go, wow, okay, that's interesting, but I wouldn't know what they're talking about, right? So um, the point being, right, so there are a couple points here. One is, if you want to realize something, you have to help yourself become a fully fledged person, right? The other point is, you have to, when we're talking to somebody else, to recognize, there's this, what is that person ready to realize, and not wasting your time trying to convince them of something that's too far from where they're at in terms of reasoning, right? You have to recognize where you yourself or somebody else are at. And then, so then I'll just very briefly remind you from last time. So what this next part is getting at is the three modes, right? And I reviewed those, but I'm just going to go over them very quickly now. So the three modes are when somebody has realized the three modes, they're a fully fledged person. They're ready to, the process of realizing the three modes is the process of moving towards and then having an inferential cognition. So the first mode, and I'm going to use the same example, I'm just to simplify it, I'm going to use the example they're using, right, which is the proof that sound is impermanent because it's a product. So the first is the property of the subject. So the subject of that proof is sound. And in this case, you have to realize the property of sound, which is that it's a product, right? And so, and I just want to point out, right, so that's the property of the subject. That's the first of the three modes. Now, in order to do that, you have to know what sound is. You have to know what a product is. And you have to know that sound is a product, right? Then the second of the three modes is the pervasion, right? And the pervasion would be, in this case, would be whatever is a product is pervaded, this is the pervasion, is pervaded by being impermanent. And remember, impermanent in Buddhism means changes instant by instant, or doesn't last for a second instant. So its very nature is changing instant by instant, right? And so you'd have to think, could there be something that's a product? And if you might say, oh, that sounds reasonable. That's not realizing the pervasion. Realizing the pervasion is that you have a valid cognition already that anything that's a product, by its very nature, must be changing instant, changing instant by instant. And then you also have to realize the third of the three modes, the counter pervasion. And that would be one way, I like this way of putting it. Whatever would be permanent would necessarily not be a product, right? So if something were permanent, it could not be a product. That's the flip side. Counter pervasion means it's the flip side of the pervasion, right? So the pervasion was whatever is a product is impermanent. The implication of that is also that if something were permanent, it couldn't be a product, because products are necessarily impermanent, right? And so a fully fledged person has to have totally realized actually a fully fledged person has to have totally realized those things. But now the text gets into, this is now you can understand the next part of the text here, where it goes through divisions. And what it gets at is this, is I'll go down to here, divisions, where it says, it's saying how there are two types of people. This is getting, I want to describe what this is getting at without reading the words. What this is getting at is I'll say it this way. If somebody hasn't realized that sound is a product, and they haven't realized that all products are impermanent, if they haven't realized either one, then that person's not suitable, right? To be trying to prove that sound is impermanent because it's a product. However, this is what this next section is getting at. If the person has realized one of those two things, well, then if you help them realize the other, they can gain the realization of this topic, right? So it's saying, if someone wants to, if you're trying to help somebody or yourself understand this, that sound is impermanent, if they already understand that sound is a product, right, then you can help them, right? Or you can help yourself if you realize that. You can go to that person and say, and help them understand all products are impermanent. And once they realize that, boom, they're going to understand, they're going to gain the inferential cognition, right? On the flip side, if somebody has thought a lot about impermanence and has realized that all products are impermanent, but they haven't yet thought about sound, right? Then if you help them understand, well, sound is the nature of sound is that it's a product. They've already realized that products are impermanent. So once they realize that the property of the subject in that way, bang, they're going to gain an inferential cognition, right? So it's saying those are the two types of people for whom who can be helped by this, right? And so you could ask yourself, am I such a person, right? And if you're not, then you'd have to go backwards, right? You'd have to say, well, first I have to realize something more fundamental, which is that, for example, if I haven't realized that all products are impermanent, I have to analyze that. Leave aside sound, right? And ask, is something that's produced necessarily impermanent? Which is not so easy to realize, right? You have to, like there is, yeah. So you'd have to actually think quite deeply about that. Are all things, and I want to remind you also, impermanent, right? What does that mean? Again, I said this a minute ago, but to really think deeply, what does that mean? Instantaneous, right? Changes instant by instant, because that's not what people, that's not what we often mean by impermanent, right? Often when we say impermanent, we mean like someday will change. This is not saying it'll someday change. This is saying this is saying today it'll change. This is saying this instant it'll change, right? And by the way, that's a somewhat hidden phenomena, isn't it? In other words, gross impermanence. If you smash a cup and it breaks, that's an obvious phenomenon, right? But that a cup is changing instant by instant. If you buy a new cup and you look at it, you can't see that it's changed 5 minutes later, right? Your eyes don't perceive that, but it is, isn't it? It's changing instant by instant. And so you have to analyze that and see if you agree. But that's Buddhism's asserting that's true. Actually, that's not. If you understand that things are made up of, right? Like, actually, if you study, it's weird, isn't it? Like, we don't realize that, but like, I mean, if you grew up in America, like I remember in school is similar, right? Studying like that things are made up of atoms and that electrons are going around protons and neutrons or something. Now it's more subtle than that, but so that's like, I mean, actually, that's implying, right? That's implying what Buddhism is saying, that things are changing unbelievably fast, right? All a cup is that, right? So of course it's changing instant by instant, right? But that's not how it appears to us. And actually, I often think these kind of things, like, why didn't I sit down and, like, when my teacher told me that when I was in elementary school, why did I like freak out? I don't know, like, it was like, because things are not how they seem, right? But we don't think deeply. We just say, okay, I'll memorize that. And that's what I'm trying to get at here today at the beginning, is don't do that with pramana, right? In other words, don't be like I was in elementary school. The teacher says, memorize how many electrons or how many protons, and I memorize it and I go on. And I don't even sit down and think, well, wait a second. Like, so my bed is made up of that? Like, why don't I fall through it? I don't understand, and I didn't ask all those questions, right? As a little kid. I didn't understand, I didn't really understand what they were saying. I just memorized it, and I didn't think about the implications, right? That my house is made up of that. Like, as a little kid, I didn't think if my house is made up of that, then it doesn't exist how I see it, right? Neither does my mom or dad. It didn't occur to me at the time. I didn't think deeply, but we shouldn't do that with pramana. We should think deeply about what are the implications. So anyway, you get the idea here. So a person who's going to be the right person for this kind of reasoning would have to have realized at least one of the two things, and then you help yourself or somebody else realize the other, and then you can gain an inferential cognition. And so I'll read number one now, just to go through it. It's getting at those two things above, right? So you'll get the implication. So the definition of the first thing of those two above, something's being a mind apprehending a sign, and the proof that sound is impermanent by the sign product that comprehends sound as a product is, so it's a knower, right? It's a state of mind, a knower, right? in the continuum of a full-fledged other party for whom sound is being proved to be impermanent by the signed product, that is the common locus of, right? So this is the example of one example, the first of the two examples. So there's the common locus of being incontrovertible with respect to sound as a product, and also being the cause of an inferential cognizer that realizes that sound is impermanent by the signed product and arises as dependence upon its acting as a causal condition. So what it's saying there, right, is, as I said earlier, I just want to make sure it's clear, is that this person, this is an example, right? This person is incontrovertible in the sense that they know incontrovertibly and validly that sound itself is a product, right? And it becomes an inferential cognition because upon understanding that all products are impermanent, they realize, they actually gain an inferential cognition that sound is impermanent, meaning momentary, right? And do you see the idea here? Like, so I just want to point something out, right? So something, it's really interesting, like a correct reason doesn't serve as correct reason, according to this definition, unless the person gains inferential cognition, right? And it's funny, it just reminded me of something I want to share. Like I remember when I was in graduate school in psychology, a professor he was quoting actually Bion, this famous psychoanalyst, but the professor said, you know, the professor said, made an interesting point, was he said, if you give a wonderful insight and it doesn't help the other person realize something about themselves, it was wrong. It wasn't useful. It was a waste of time. Like, it doesn't matter. In other words, what he was saying was, you know, your reason can be correct, but if the other person, he was actually giving a point from Pramana, right? He was saying it doesn't matter if your reason is correct. If you're giving the reason at the wrong moment and that person isn't capable of using it, then that's not, then it doesn't serve the function. That's what this is saying, right? In a similar way. So in other words, so if you say, oh, all products are impermanent to somebody who hasn't realized sound is a product, it's not going to induce that realization. And then the second, as I already said, right, this one is incontrovertible. It already knows that all products are impermanent. And then when it's presented with the sign, the reason that sound is a product, it realizes that sound is impermanent. I want to make sure you get it though also. One is, this is a common example, sound is impermanent. But in other words, they're just using that as an illustration. Does that make sense? This would now apply to anything, any topic you're trying to realize, right? Anything from like, you know, that, you know, I don't know, that your neighbor didn't do what you think they did to bother you, all the way up to realizing the most subtle view of emptiness, right? You know, or anything, everything from like that you're, you know, that your best friend, when they said such and such, didn't mean what you think they meant, right? And then, you know, you have to have, like, you still get like, say this the right way, like if you're having an argument with somebody, right? Sometimes you're not the fully fledged vessel, right? They can present the correct reason to you, but you're not willing to listen. You know, so you know, so that's, I mean, I'm pointing out this kind of point about valid cognition applies to everything from an argument with your friend up to realizing the most subtle view of emptiness. Are you a fully fledged person? Right? Do you, and can you, and anyway, so we have to make ourselves a fully fledged person. Okay, so that's that part, and then I'll just pause there very briefly, because then we'll go on to another. It's related, but slightly different time. Any questions about what I've said so far about the three modes and being a fully fledged person? Okay. So now it says when the first mind's apprehending a sign in the proof that sound is impermanent by the sign product that comprehend that sound is a product are divided, there are three. And so it's saying, this is just saying, if you've realized, you know, so, and then again, we're using sound as impermanent to be anything, right? What it's getting at is realizing the, in that case, the property of the subject, right? And so it's saying there are three, this text, I don't get into an issue with it, but this text is saying there are three ways to realize the property of the subject. One is through direct perception, right? It says here, direct perceivers. Another is through inferential cognition, and another is through a subsequent cognizer. And so when you're realizing the property of the subject, you can do so, in any case, in any example of a proof statement, you might do so through a direct perception, like seeing, and direct perception, as remember, right, are non-conceptual knowers, seeing, hearing, taste, touch, so on. Through an inferential cognition, or through, I remember, subsequent cognizers are correct, in this case, are correct cognizers, but after inferential cognizers that are would be a new, in this case, would be a new valid cognizer. So some subsequent cognizer could be that you realize that topic earlier and you remember it, you bring it back, or you not just remember it, it could be after a while, you're still contemplating it also. And then you use that as a reason that understands the property of the subject. First of all, in general, that's quite clear. I just want to point out, though, that I will point out here just briefly that the presence of the three, right, the first of the three, direct perceivers, some geshes in the commentaries were making an interesting point, I guess, which is somewhat interesting, I guess, which is that this is certainly ordinary. In the example they're giving, though, sound is impermanent, right? So the person has realized sound is in this example, the person has realized sound is a product. Let's see. Oh, that's interesting. Huh. I think actually the geshes were wrong. That's funny. I wrote down a note because some geshes made a point, but actually I actually think I'm being arrogant. I could be wrong, but I think they were wrong. Because they were pointing out that direct perceivers of ordinary people don't realize subtle impermanence. In other words, that's direct perceivers can realize gross impermanence. We can notice that, as I said earlier, we can notice, if you smash a cup and it breaks, your eyes can see that the cup is grossly impermanent because it broke, right? So your eye consciousness can realize that. But eye consciousness don't realize subtle impermanence, instantaneous change. We have an illusion that things are not changing because of the nature of our eye consciousness. So they were making the correct point that eye consciousnesses don't realize subtle impermanence, neither do nose consciousness and so on. But this isn't saying that, actually. This is saying that this is actually saying that direct perceivers can realize that sound is a product, right? That's what Perbichog here is saying. And of course, direct perceivers can realize that, can't they? Like, in other words, because you can like, what's there to say, right? That's an interesting question. Actually, I'm not sure. I mean, the geshes weren't addressing this. So, like, let's say you see something, like, I'll just give an example. If you see me ring this bell, right? That's an interesting question. Is it a direct perceiver? I'm just asking the question. I don't know. I haven't thought about this yet. So, is that a direct perceiver realizing that even that, let's leave it aside, that are all sounds a product? That's a more complex question. Is that a direct perceiver realizing that sound is a product? If a young child sees two objects hit and hears sound, that's an interesting question. Is it their direct perceiver that's really, because it's an eye consciousness that sees, let's say, this, right? And it's an ear consciousness that hears the sound. So I don't know. Actually, that's an interesting question. Is there a direct perceiver that can realize that sound is a product? Or is that an inferential cognition? Or so if a young child, like, just actually check for yourself, right? Here, if I do this, and you see my hands hitting, and you hear a sound, right? So your eye, just think about that for a moment. I don't know the answer, actually. Your eye consciousness is perceiving two objects meeting. Your ear consciousness perceives the sound, how do you draw the connection between those two? Right, those are two direct. So in other words, because it's a direct, the eye consciousness seeing this is a direct perceiver. The ear consciousness that heard the sound is a direct perceiver. What's the consciousness that links those two? Is that a direct perceiver, or is that a what's the word? Or is that a conceptual knower?
I think it has to be a conceptual knower, right? At least, in my house right now, I can hear people upstairs. I can hear the heat cooking on, but I know that's not coming from your hands. I know the clapping sound is coming from your hands, but I have to put that together in my head, right? Even though it happens instantaneously. So it has to be.
I would argue the same. Yeah, I agree. And so therefore, oh, sorry, Lynn, go ahead.
Couldn't it be the sound could be a direct perceiver in that the sound changes constantly? You don't hear one sound, you hear a sound that changes. You may not be able to see where the sound comes from, but that doesn't make it direct. That doesn't make it not a direct perception.
Right.
You can hear as a direct perception, and that sound changes from moment to moment if you listen or if you're capable of that. So you can directly perceive a sound changing from moment to moment. You may not see it or you may not know where it comes from, but you can hear it change. So that would be a direct perception, no?
Yeah, the hearing, yeah. The hearing consciousness, hearing the sound is for sure a direct perception. That's right.
But it takes a subsequent step to realize it's coming from hands, right? To understand, to put it together to the hands coming together and be like, that's hands clapping. That's a subsequent step.
Yeah. Yeah, now you're right. I think that's conceptual. Yeah. So it's an interesting question. What's an example of a direct perceiver that could understand that sound as a product? So there may not be one, is the point here. I'm just sort of debating that point. Sujata has a comment.
I'm just thinking about cause and effect and how they are divided in my mind, and that feels related in some way to my incapacity to see things directly. Like I'm seeing the hands as the cause and I'm hearing the sound as the effect, and there's a gap there, if that makes sense. It feels like definitely things are cogitating in order to put those two things together. And I'm curious about the enlightened state being one in which there aren't those gaps. And so that's what it felt like to me in the moment.
That's interesting. Right. And part of it is that, because, yeah, if you think about it, right, a conceptual knower uses, a mental image or language, right? Which is different than the direct perception, although we mix them, we think they're mixed. Yeah, whereas, well, one point, enlightened beings don't do that, right? So but they know cause and effect, right? The famous line, Om Ye Dharma, Hetu Prabhava, Hetu Deshan Tathagata, right? That means that the Tathagata knows the causes, and knows the causes for arising and the causes for not arising of things, right? But the Tathagata knows that directly, not conceptually. One gone, thus gone, knows that directly, not conceptually. Well, one last thing I'll say, this is just raising the question, can direct perceivers know that, know the property of the subject? I'll say from a Buddhist perspective, I don't know. In the case of sound being a product, I'm not sure. It's hard to, as Ryan pointed out, it'd be hard to argue that can be known. But Buddhism does say that sometimes a direct perceiver can know the property of the subject, in the sense that, I'll give an example. Like if they say actually, I'll give an example from a text I was reading. One text points out that direct perception can know that fire, like if you're watching fire burn something, like, if you see a fire, like burning a piece of paper, right? If somebody lights a piece of paper on fire, your eye conscious can know the proper, they say your eye conscious can know the property of the subject in the sense, if the subject, if it were knowing that fire burns things, right? Your eye conscious can see that directly. And so if the property of the subject were that, then it is possible for a direct perceiver to sometimes know the property of the subject. But in the case of sound as impermanent, I'm not so sure. I think there is some conceptual, for ordinary beings, I think there's some conceptuality there. So anyway, I think Perpechoke's point in general still stands, which is that sometimes the mind that knows the property of the subject is a direct perceiver. Sometimes it's an inferential cognizer. I think often it's an inferential cognizer, or probably more often it's the latter, it's the last, it's the subsequent cognizer, right? In other words, you've thought about something and you've come to understand it, and therefore you know that. And then it makes the same point again about the second kind. So that was about the first point, right? Knowing that sound is a product. And then it says the same thing applies for knowing the pervasion, right? That the pervasion, and he said, Perpechoke here is saying that the pervasion can also be the cognizer realizing the pervasion can be a direct perceiver, an inferential cognizer, or a subsequent cognizer. And so it's saying that, yeah, either of those is possible. Again, it's interesting. I don't, one could debate, and this is what these geshes were getting at. So they are, one could debate Perpechoke. If you look at the bottom of page 14, he's giving the example of direct perceiver, and he says, from among these, an illustration of the first, a direct perceiver, that is a mind apprehending a sign, and the proof that sound is impermanent by the sign product, that comprehends that whatever is a product necessarily impermanent. Now, this is the controversial part, just for what it's worth. Is a direct perceiver comprehending that whatever is a product is necessarily impermanent? So I guess what I'd ask is, I'm not, this is what those Geshe were saying. Actually, I agree with them here. I mean, how can there be a direct perceiver for an ordinary being that realizes that whatever is a product is necessarily impermanent? The Geshe pointing out that has to be an inferential cognition, they're arguing, or a subsequent cognizer. There is no direct perceiver. That example doesn't stand. And I agree with the Geshes on that. They're right. I don't think, and Ryan said the same thing. How can a direct perceiver of an ordinary person? Now there's a yogi might realize, and this is, I guess, the other part. There are certain, Buddhism would accept a yogi who's realized calm abiding and is meditating on the subtle impermanence of phenomena. They could have a direct perceiver, but an ordinary person couldn't. So maybe Perpechoke's referring to yogis like that. Maybe the yogi would be, that such a yogi would be the fully fledged other party. In that case, and then that would stand. So, so maybe it would be that. But anyway, for most of us, it would have to be an inferential cognizer or a subsequent cognizer that arose through the power of an inferential cognition. But I guess step back just for a moment. The more general point here, just to remind us, right, is what are we getting at? What we're getting at is, with anything, we're using an example of sound being impermanent, but to understand anything correctly, right, it has to be based upon a direct perception, an inferential, or you have to understand the property of the subject and the pervasion at least, right, and then the counter pervasion also. And you can understand those via direct perception, via inferential cognition, or you could have previously understood it through inferential cognition and then have a subsequent cognizer. I suppose in theory it could also be previously through direct cognition and then it's a subsequent cognizer. So any of those, but so it could be any of those three things, right? A direct perceiver, inferential cognizer, or subsequent cognizer. And I guess, and then and then dependent upon that, those kinds of minds, right, where you realize the property of the subject and you realize the pervasion, you can then realize the inferential cognition, right? And then it's an incontrovertible knowing of something. I guess I just want to pause there to ask, just to suggest, to offer, what's the word? To offer an option, offer something. what it's worth, which is what I've been finding really helpful about this, is think for a moment, or think for a week, or two, about all the things. Again, this is saying, Buddhism is here is saying you can know things correctly, right? But what I want to ask, because this is just, I personally, I find this amazing and almost like mind-blowing, is on the one hand, what are the things I actually know through inferential cognition, right? And to come up with an example of that first, right? What's something I actually know through inferential cognition? Actually pause and think of one thing that you know through inferential cognition. So you know the property of the subject, and you know the pervasion. And now I'm going to challenge, this is the part that's mind-blowing to me. Think about something that you feel totally confident you know, that you like would be upset if somebody, you would like really be annoyed if somebody disagreed with it. If somebody said you were wrong about that, you would be annoyed, right? And that if you're honest with yourself, you don't really know. You just think it's true. You don't know through inferential cognition because you haven't realized the property of the subject and you haven't realized the pervasion of that. And I just want to point out, like, if you do that about, like, if you think about examples of that in relation to your, you could do it in relation to world events and politics and so on. You can do it in relation to your own family. You can do it in relation to your friends. You can do it in relation to your work. It's just disturbing to realize there are so many things, right, there are things we actually know, but there are also many things that we believe we know for certain that we haven't realized are true. And I remember, like, it's just a simplistic example, but I remember, oftentimes, many times, Lama Zopa does it, but Kopar, I remember him the first time I remember it particularly, was he was pointing out this point, like, Westerners were there and were saying, and he was saying, there are past and future lives. And then they were saying, well, I don't believe in past and future lives. And he made a point. He said, there is no sentient beings who has realized there is no past and future lives. Right? In other words, that cannot be realized. And so, and my point is, like, what are the cultural beliefs you have that you believe, but that you can't realize, that you haven't realized? What are the family beliefs you have, that you were told as a child that you believe, but you haven't realized? And then what if they're wrong is the question, right? They're not all wrong. I'm not saying that, right? But if you haven't realized something, then it might be wrong. If you have realized something, then it's right. Does that make sense? But we confuse, all I'm pointing out is this, part of what this is implying is we often confuse our convictions with what we've realized. And this is pointing out, what does it mean to realize something? I'll give you actually my example of the realize, I'm just giving you a very simplistic example. I've realized incontrovertibly that if I put paper into a fire, it'll burn up. And so anytime I put paper into a fire and it catches fire, it will burn. That's something I can know incontrovertibly. But what are the things that I believe just as strongly as that, but that are wrong, actually, or might be wrong? Or I don't know, that I have to, actually, if I analyze, I have to say, actually, I don't know. I believe this, but actually I don't know. And that's disturbing when you realize, like, oh, wow, I felt just as certain as the paper would burn in a fire, a piece of paper would burn in fire, I believed that X, And the fact that we don't differentiate that, I'm just going to go off on a small tangent here. Actually, that's what, I mean, because it's true, right? Is all of us, right? That's what makes us susceptible to misinformation, right? That's what makes us, as human beings, susceptible to misinformation that helps lengthen pandemics or causes wars or causes us to go fight in wars or all kinds of things like that, right? And because we don't differentiate those things. What do I know for certain? And what do I believe that might not be true? So anyway, it's just a question. It's just a question to contemplate. So then Perpetual goes on. Valid cognizers that induce ascertainment by themselves and valid cognizers when ascertainment is induced by another. And this becomes a really interesting topic as we go into it. So I'll just share, first of all, the snow and ice here, so it's just like ice going on. Distracting. Yesterday was warm and ice storm. But I want to be clear where it says by another. It is important to understand if you're going to understand the section. Another can be, but doesn't have to be another person. It can be another moment of your own consciousness also, right? So there are valid cognizers that induce ascertainment by themselves, and there are valid cognizers that induce ascertainment of a certain point in dependence upon another. The other could be somebody else telling you, or it could be a future moment of your own consciousness. I'm probably going to use most of the examples of your own consciousness, future moments of your own consciousness, but it could be either. So, because the word another can have different, in English can mean either, can it? But you could easily take that to mean another person. It doesn't necessarily mean another person. It could mean another moment of your own consciousness. Okay, so there are valid cognizers that induce ascertainment by themselves, and there are valid cognizers when ascertainment is induced by another. And just to explain at one point here, valid cognizers that induce ascertainment by themselves can be either direct or inferential valid cognizers. And valid cognizers when ascertainment is induced by another only refers to direct valid. All those are direct valid cognizers. So we'll continue on. It's going to explain them, so I'm not going to try to explain it because Perpetual's going to explain these things more. So he says, with respect to these, there are two parts of definitions and divisions. Our own system is as follows, and then he quotes Gendon Drup. Gendon Drup is the first Dalai Lama, who was a famous, first Dalai Lama was famous for having been the first Dalai Lama. He was a direct disciple of Tsongkhapa, and he founded Tashi Limpo Monastery. But anyway, he wrote a number of texts on pramana. He's well known for being a pramana author. So this is quoting one of his texts, or paraphrasing one of his texts. So here we go. The definition of a valid cognizer that induces ascertainment by itself is, it is a valid cognizer and it is able to induce ascertainment through its own power with respect to its own non-arising if the nature of the object of comprehension did not abide within the object. Right, so again, these can be either direct or inferential valid cognizers, but by themselves or through their own power, where it says like it would not non-arising, just to clarify, what that means is that that it's a valid cognizer and that its very nature is that it arises because it understands the nature of a thing, right? So it's correctly comprehending a nature of thing through its own power. Whereas the definition of a valid cognizer when ascertainment is induced by another is it's also a valid cognizer, but ascertainment must be induced through the power of another valid cognizer with respect to its own non-arising if the nature of the object of comprehension did not abide within the object. And again, I'm just going to go on a little further because it's going to sort of explain. Okay, so here, this is quite straightforward. Okay, yeah, we'll keep going. So now he's going to talk more about what are, in our own system, when valid cognizers that induce ascertain by themselves are divided, there are 5. So these are, again, the ones that through their own power, they don't need another, right? They don't need a future valid cognizer or something else to induce ascertainment. So he points out there are 5 types of these. Sensory sense direct valid cognizers to which the ability to perform a function appears. Sense direct valid cognizers that have a familiar object. Self-knowing direct valid cognizers, yogic direct valid cognizers, and inferential. So that's why I said they can also be inferential. Whatever is one of those 5 is necessarily a valid cognizer that induces ascertainment by itself. And then he gives examples. So he says, so the first is a sense direct valid cognizer to which the ability to perform a function. This is what I mentioned earlier about fire, for example. He says, so this is where a sense is, for example, a sense direct perceiver that apprehends fire as being able to perform the functions of cooking and burning. Okay. And so, that's that you can actually, that's interesting. You could, I mean, actually, that would, so it's a sensory direct valid cognizer that can see the function of a thing, right? In the same way, actually, right? If you, actually, you could in the same way, right? I mean, there are many functions, right? You can direct, what it's getting at is that direct perceivers can sometimes perceive function. You could, so for example, you could watch a horse clean itself in the water, right? And your eye conscious can see the dirt coming off the horse. Here, he doesn't say which sense, right? Because this one with fire being able to burn, right? That, well, it depends what it is, isn't it? Like if you put your hand in a fire, it would be a sensory, right? I mean, actually, your hand sense consciousness would directly perceive fire's ability to burn, wouldn't it? On the other hand, a visual conscious could watch that happen. I guess with cooking, it could even be maybe an olfactory consciousness, because we say, oh, it smells good, for example. Right? So anyway, so it's getting at that sense direct perceivers can directly, on their own, without any other help, perceive the function, perceive certain kinds of functions. Then the second, a sense direct valid cognizer having familiar object is, for example, a sense direct perceiver in the continuum of a son apprehending his father's form. Right, so that would be, and that what they're getting at there, just to be clear, is that sense, that sense, actually, it's an important point here. I mean, this seems like a simple example, right? A father seeing the son's form. But what they're getting at is that sense direct valid cognizers that are sensory can be trained to recognize the familiar, right? There comes a point where even without words and concepts, like certain basic things, the sensory conscious itself can recognize. So, and it's like when they do studies of like young babies who can turn, who if they hear the sound of their mother's voice turns towards it, things like that. They're getting at here. That there are ways in which sense direct perceivers can recognize familiar objects. And that it may be actually, I think that's in dependence upon, it would be actually, those would be dependent upon previous experience and even previous conceptuality sometimes. But it's that sense direct perceivers can be trained to recognize familiar objects. That's really all it's saying. Then the third, self-knowers. We already know self-knowers, right, are those subtle, whatever. In this tenet system, it's a consciousness that induces memory. So the third would be a self-knowing direct perceiver that experiences an eye consciousness. So, that's just saying that would be a valid cognizer, because if your eye is seeing blue, they're saying there's a self-knower, according to this tenet system, that knows the eye saw blue and therefore can remember. The fourth, a yogic direct valid cognizer, that he gives the example of an omniscient consciousness knowing the mind of another. This could also be a yogic valid cognizer. It could also be, a moment in the continuum of a bodhisattva directly realizing emptiness or selflessness, according to the school. Actually, they wouldn't say emptiness, selflessness. And then an inferential cognizer would be the typical example they use, right? An inferential valid cognizer would be, the example he gives is an inferential consciousness realizing sound to be impermanent. So those are the kinds of valid cognizers that induce ascertainment by themselves. And it means they understand, how do we say it? They understand the nature of the object through their own power. Then, when ascertainment when ascertainment is induced by another, are divided terminologically, there are three. By the way, whenever it says terminologically, that, and just so you know this in Buddhist texts, when they say we can divide it, if they say we can divide it into three, like above, when he said we can divide it into five, he just said we're divided into five. That means all five are going to be what we're talking about. In a Buddhist text, when they say are going to be divided terminologically, what that means is one of them is not actually what we're talking about. That we can call it that sometimes, but it's not actually that. Does that make sense? So that's a tendency in Buddhist texts when they say we're going to, like, so if I say, anyway, when they use that term terminologically, it means we're going to use the term, but not all of them are actual examples of what we're talking about. That's clear. Okay, so the three types of valid cognizers when ascertainment is induced by another are initial direct perceivers, inattentive direct perceivers, and direct perceivers having a cause of error. So the first, an initial direct perceiver, is, for example, a sense direct perceiver in the continuum of a person who has not previously experienced seeing an utpala flower that apprehends the color of that utpala, which is blue. Utpalas are blue. Actually, I'm going to continue on, then I'll go back. The second, an inattentive direct perceiver, is, for example, a sense direct perceiver that apprehends the sound in the continuum of a person whose mind is especially attracted to beautiful form. And the third, a direct perceiver having the cause of error, is, for example, a sense direct perceiver apprehending the color of a mirage that directly generates the superimposition apprehending the mirage as water. Since I said, right, terminologically means they're not all actual valid cognizers. Of these three, which is an actual valid cognizer and which are not valid cognizers? Can you tell? Right, that's the issue of terminologically, right? So somebody, Lynn, yeah, go ahead.
Wouldn't it only be the immediate direct perceiver?
Good job.
Because it's immediate.
Yep. Yeah, the immediate direct perceiver is a correct example of a valid cognizer when ascertainment is induced by another. Whereas, you're right, and I'll just clarify. So the second, right, the sense direct perceiver that is inattentive, right, is not a valid cognizer because it's a consciousness to which an object appears but is not ascertained. And valid cognizers ascertain their objects correctly. So it's a different kind of consciousness, right? It doesn't ascertain its object, and therefore it's not a valid cognizer. And the last one is not a valid cognizer because it's actually a wrong consciousness, isn't it? I mean, the one that perceives the mirage as water is incorrect. So how could that be a valid cognizer, right? So the only one that's a valid cognizer is the first, as Lynn said correctly. And you understand what, actually, I want to point out here something. This is we're going to get into this in the next page, but I think this is important, and then I'll explain later. Hopefully, we'll have time today. I'll explain a little bit why it's important. But there is a little issue. It's important to distinguish this. So that consciousness that they're talking about, right? in this case, it was an eye the example they're giving is the eye conscious that perceives blue, right, which is the color of an oud pullet flower. By the way, many deities like hold oud pullet flowers. White Tara holds them, so you'll see them in paintings of White Tara. So with regards to, first of all, with regards to the color blue, that consciousness is a valid cognizer that induces ascertainment by itself, right? It sees blue, and so with regards to that, it's a valid cognizer that induces ascertainment by itself. But with regards to that, it saw the color, the blue of an oud pullet flower, it's a valid cognizer when ascertainment is induced by another. And that's because it's never seen an oud pullet before, right? So in other words, so you have to go in, what's this getting at experientially, right? And actually, this is a very ordinary kind of experience. You see blue, right? You see a blue oud pullet flower. You have a valid cognizer of the color blue, but you don't know yet that that blue is a blue oud pullet. Later, somebody tells you, for example, right? Oh, wow, did you see the oud pullet? Like I was back at the pond and I saw, you go, let's say you're at some place, right? And then you come in and you say, I was at the pond and I saw the most beautiful blue flower. And the person says, oh, the oud pullet bloomed, right? That's the other, right? So in other words, the other is this moment where you then realize, oh, that blue I saw was an oud pullet. Wow, I've always wondered what oud pullets look like, something like that, whatever, right? So the first moment was a valid cognizer of blueness, but it became, right, there was through the power of another moment later, a subsequent moment in that case, you ascertained correctly that it was the blue of an oud pullet. I'll give another example for a moment. Like if you meet, like let's say you're at a event and you see a person, right? And you notice them, but you don't know who they are, right? And then later you become friends with them, right? You had, at the first moment, you had a valid cognizer seeing a person, right? Actually, I can remember, I'll just go, I actually just off the top of my head. I remember when I first saw Sujata, I didn't know, I was at Vajrapani, I didn't know who she was. But I saw her and then later we talked, right? So I'm just picking her as the example. But so there was a valid cognizer seeing a person, right? Initially. That's fun. And then that's fun. And then later, a later moment induced an ascertainment. Oh, that person I saw was named Sujata, right? And so you see the point here that there is a valid cognizer when ascertainment is induced by another. On its own is a valid cognizer induced by itself. But it subsequently becomes a valid cognizer induced by another because it realizes something else about what it initially validly cognized that's correct about that object, right, or that person in this case, but whatever, so it could be the color of an oud pullet or a person or anything, any of many different things, right? Actually, I just want to slow down there though. Do you see how what this is getting at experientially? This is getting at, again, how do you know things, right? And do you see what I mean? I just want to point something out because this is very much Buddhism. Have you ever noticed how that happens, right? How you perceive something and how you can later how you can have a valid cognition of something and later have another valid cognition induced by another moment about that thing. Right? Yeah, anyway, that's what that's getting at.
question, Lauren?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, thanks. Getting back to the differences and similarities between a direct perceiver and a valid cognizer. So it seems that, yeah, not all direct perceivers are valid cognizers, if I'm correct. But for example, are all valid cognizers direct perceivers?
No.
No.
No, because I'll give it. So first of all, you're correct. You're right about the first point that not all direct perceivers are valid cognizers. And here's an example. A very easy example of that would be a subsequent cognizer. Like, so in other words, that you could have a direct perceiver that's a subsequent cognizer. Like if I'm staring at a tree, let's say for a while, the initial because valid cognizers in this system are new, right? So the first moment of recognizing that tree and apprehending it would be a valid cognizer, but subsequent moments after that would be subsequent cognizers, and those would be direct perceptions. I'm staring at the tree with my eyes, let's say, but they're not valid cognizers. They're correct or consciousnesses, but they're not valid cognizers because they're not new, and part of the definition of valid cognizers. That would be an example of that. And then regarding your second point, though, not all valid cognizers are direct perceivers, because inferential cognizers can be valid cognizers, and those are conceptual. And so an example of that would be if I'm contemplating, is sound impermanent or not, and I'm a fully fledged person, and I realize that sound is a product, and I realize all products are impermanent, then I would gain an inferential valid cognition of the impermanence of sound, and that would be an example of a valid cognizer that would not be a direct perceiver because it's conceptual. Yeah.
Very good. Thanks.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But and then like even a simpler, and just to give one more, like a simpler one would be a simple example of a valid cognizer that's not a direct perceiver would be that like right now I'm looking, I'm thinking, oh, that's Frank, and there's a conceptual element of that, right? If I think that's Frank, that's conceptual, but it's valid. It's valid cognizer. That could be a valid cognizer if it were the first time. If it's a new, as long as it's new. If it's not new, then it's a subsequent cognizer. So there are many. I guess my point is that there are many valid cognizers that are inferential valid cognizers.
Thank you.
Sure. And then somebody else said, was it Lynn? Oh, Lynn.
For your first category, not the terminologically,
Right.
but the first category, I'm stuck on the sound thing because the second category you said are the sense direct perceivers can be trained to recognize an object. So if you're trained in music, you could hear a sound and know how it was produced. You're trained. But is that inferential, or that would be a direct perception the way I'd see it? Because you've heard it, or if you know what a sound is, you know what a C major is, or you have perfect pitch. You can hear the sound, and it's a direct perception, and you know it's a product.
That's interesting. I guess I would differentiate two parts of what you're saying, because I personally think, on the one hand, like I think it's one part's easy, like I in my opinion at least, which is like you're right, a person with perfect pitch who can recognize a C major, let's say, right? I don't see any difference between that and the example given here of the person who recognizes their father's form. So it's the same thing, isn't it? It would be just another example of the same kind of phenomena. So somebody trained their ear consciousness to recognize a certain note, just like the person may have trained their eye consciousness to recognize their father's form through familiarity. So I think you're right on that for sure that would be. But then you made a second point, so that's more complicated. So the first one, I think you're clearly correct. It's the same as the example. The second one is an interesting question, though. In other words, like, and I'm just trying. I'm just go through it for a moment. Like, if I think of it, let's say it, like, a trained musician, this is more complex. So I don't know. I'm just trying to think it through. Like, because the first one is clear that you're right. The second one, I'm not as sure, because let's say like there are times where I hear a note. I'm not a trained musician. No, I'm not a musician, but and I can't tell what instrument it is. But I know that like a good somebody who's well trained in music would say, oh, that's an oboe immediately, right? Like, and I'm like,
Right.
whatever. Like, I can't tell if it's a trombone or something. And I guess my point is like, that's an interesting question though. Is there language or mental image? Like, is there some kind of basic version of a mental image or language? I don't know. That's an interesting question. Like,
I think it's
oboe.
purely, see, I think of it, I mean, this gets rid of the cause and effect that Sujata, I keep mispronouncing your name, was thinking of. It sort of merges the two, because you hear it in immediate, and it's an immediate direct perception.
Yeah.
And you perceive it through your hearing, not your sight, or conceptually. So it seems that you could have those. That you know through your training that in fact it's a product, you know what it's a product of, but it's a immediate direct perception.
Isn't your mind doing something, even if it's like instantaneous, something conceptual? Oh, that's what an oboe sounds like. Or like, so like if I hear the Beatles, I know instantly it's the Beatles, but like quickly in my mind, I'm hearing like there's John's voice, there's Paul's voice, that's the Beatles because they're together. It's like that. So there is a conceptual thing that's really quick though.
You're getting at the key. I just want to point out, you guys are getting at the key point here. Is it conceptual? You're raising the right question. Is there some element of conceptuality? That's the question that's important here. And it's interesting, right? Like, what they're getting at is that there comes a point with certain very simple, like the example they're giving of a child with their parent, right? Like, where it becomes non-concept. Like, in other words, where they're not thinking mom, they just immediately kind of,
right.
Like there's some kind of, the eye consciousness itself, it's so familiar that the eye consciousness sort of turns. And yeah, it's an interesting question. Like, how familiar does something have to be? And at what point is there some element of conceptuality and what is there not? That's the right question. I don't know with the specific example, I don't know the answer, to be honest. Like, I'm not certain, but.
So that's interesting to me, because oftentimes in practice, like you hear about like, all right, you want to do something like spontaneously, like, something happens and you spontaneously feel compassion for those people, as opposed to like it happening 10 seconds later or 30 seconds later after you start thinking about it, like spontaneous. But the idea is that like, if you practice, like it might take 30 seconds, then it takes 10, then eventually it can become spontaneous, right? So thinking about it that way, then thinking about like what Lynn was saying about like somebody who could hear a sound and instantly know, like maybe you could get to the point where you train your mind to where it doesn't take any conceptuality at all anymore. But that's the first thing I thought of when she said that. So.
Or it's a little, I'm sorry, very crosstalk. It's a little bit like the difference between Western music, which you have a score and you go along the score, and jazz. Jazz is improvisational. So they don't think that's this note or that's on the score. Because it was based in Africa, it's forward looking, it's instantaneous. In other words, it's improvisational. So that's the way they hear the sound. It's like they hear it and they move on. It's like, at least that's the way it's described. Jazz musicians describe it.
And then Sujata.
I may be unnecessarily complicating things, but when I'm thinking back to the, so I'm listening to the radio, and I'm a musician, and so like I hear a bassoon or an oboe. Let's use the same example. An oboe comes. It feels instant that I know it's an oboe. And I think where I'm trying to understand, I think where things are getting complicated for me is how the oboe is a product, or the experience of the sound coming from the radio to my ears also, like it's all compounded phenomenon, right? So like when I think about the first time I could see pain, so it was in a meditation course, right? So it was, my knee hurts, right? And it feels like instant, like the knee hurts and I know that that is knee pain. And let's just talk about the knee pain. But then when you really start to break it down, like pain is actually compounded phenomenon, right? It's pressure, it's pulsing, it's tingling, it's stretching, it's all these things. And then you don't really suffer the pain as much when you can disaggregate it into its component parts. And I think that where I'm having trouble with the notion of a direct perceiver of things that are compounded. Like I feel like it's, even if it's happening at this, like, so when I experience pain in the day-to-day, I'm walking around, I'm not sitting, observing, I'm not scanning my body for sensations, I'm not breaking things down, I'm not seeing component parts. There's a, but when I'm walking around the world and I step on something funny and my knee hurts, it feels like a singular object. It feels like there's steps that I'm missing. So it doesn't feel like a direct perception of anything. It feels like a, I don't know, maybe I'm confusing direct with compounded, but there's something there that feels like it's not an accurate, it's not valid because it's compounded in a sense, and that I'm labeling it this other thing. I don't know if this is a very clear question, but this is sort of where my confusion arises around, like the direct perception of anything. If it's a misapprehension, if it's compounded to my mind. Does that make sense?
Well, maybe go through step by step and ask you, like, try to clarify something. Because on the one hand, like, not all, but most direct perceptions, according to Buddhism, are of compounded phenomena. You know, like, so, I mean, just in the very simplistic sense, like if I'm looking, an example I gave earlier, if I'm looking at a tree or I'm looking at, and blue is a compounded phenomenon, you know, so like in the example, all the examples they give, right? If the person's seeing blue or seeing a flower or seeing red or you know, hearing sound or tasting something, like those are all compounded phenomena. So on the one hand, you know, most of the examples given are of compounded phenomena. So that's one point, is that, like, so most of many, there are, you know, actually infinite examples of direct perceptions of compounded phenomena on the one hand. But I think part of what you're getting at, which is the process itself, right? Which is, and it's interesting how they talk about it. Like, so they'll say, like in the example of the example that they gave earlier about seeing the blue Udpala, blue, and then knowing later, subsequently knowing that it's a Udpala. The actual process that they describe, which this text isn't going into so much detail yet about, or right now about, is there's a direct perceiver of a compounded phenomena, blue, right? But then, if you think about how it goes, actually, almost immediately after that, you know, so there might be like an initial valid cognizer perceiving blue. Then there might be, and depending on the person's process, like a subsequent cognizer perceiving blue. That's a sensory consciousness. But then, you know, this is all within like 2 seconds, say. There could be a conceptual knower that's labels, that now it's late language, right, and labeling. So it's blue, it says, oh, blue, like, and even wonders, right? That's conceptual, wondering what kind of, oh, I never saw, you know, like maybe not this much language, but the feeling that's implicitly there in the language is like, I've never seen a blue quite like that before. That's conceptual. Then it goes back to the subsequent cognizer, you know, and then there's this back and forth between direct perceiver and conceptual knowers, right, that are thinking, you know, like, you know, that are in some very basic way noticing like the contrast of the blue to the water behind it, or thinking I've never seen this kind of blue before, whatever. And then there's direct perceiver. So there's a back and forth that happens. And all that happens very, very quickly. So is that getting at what you're getting at? I'm not sure, like, if that's getting it, but it's all compound. I mean, so there is the, you know, the object is a compounded phenomena, but there's a whole process that's happening that's a back and forth between direct perception and conceptual knowers. That's for most of us is happening all the time, not always, but much of the time. That's what's happening.
Yeah, I think that there's something about like direct valid cognizers, right? Like I could be having a direct valid cognition of pain, right? And sort of this, I think I'm getting caught up on the words of what is valid, valid and compounded, I think was my difficulty, because it feels not valid if it's compound. Somehow in my mind I had just reached the point of it not being valid if it was compounded, because there was more there to be unpacked. So yeah, I don't know that there was something that was just a sticking point for me, but I think I just need to dispense with it and say, this is the language of this text, and this is what this is. This is a separate thing, trying to understand.
And one other quick point I'll make just related to what you said, I found this interesting, was like somebody in one of the commentaries to this section, somebody was asking this one Geshe, they were saying like, so the person, an example of the Utpala that's blue, right? They were saying, well, the person saw an Utpala, but that was blue, but they didn't know it was an Utpala, so it wasn't an Utpala. And the Geshe was saying, no, they saw a blue Utpala. And the person was like, but they didn't know it was an Utpala. And he said, but they later learned it was an Utpala. They saw a blue Utpala. And then like, and what's intriguing in a way that I'm getting at here is like, there was like, so if somebody, and I mean, implicit in what you're saying is it an Utpala intrinsically from its own side? It's just a label, of course, right? Like, but it's a blue Utpala. In other words, that's it. There is, what did they conventionally see? In the same way, like the pain, like you could break it down. So you could break down an Utpala looking for an Utpala from its own side, and you won't find it. You could break down pain and you won't find it from its own side. But what this school, in a way, would be saying is, is that if you break it down, you won't find some ultimate referent, but it is pain and it is an Utpala and so on. Yeah, so that's like, that on a conventional level, that's an Utpala in that particular language, not another language necessarily, but you get my point. So I think that's what that's getting at in a way, is that, if you look for the ultimate referent for it, that's a different question. And this school doesn't do that. They don't even look for ultimate reference for things like that. But even if you were, I guess, even if they were to say, well, because this school would say that an Utpala, isn't the referent. Anyway, I guess I'll leave it simple. You would still say it's an Utpala, like, because that's the conventional name for it. Or you would still say it's pain because that's the conventional name for it. It's a different question of like, what is it composed of? And are those, that's a different question, but still conventionally that's called pain, or that's called Utpala. Yeah, that would be the answer from this school's perspective. And then let's jump into this next section here, which I think, so it says, when valid cognizers, when ascertainment is induced by another, are again terminologically divided in another way, there are three, right? So I'll ask you the same question after I read these, but valid cognizers when the appearance is induced by itself, but the truth by another. Valid cognizers when ascertainment of the generality is induced by itself, but the particular by another. And valid cognizers when ascertainment of even the mere appearance is induced by another. And then he gives an example of each, so I'll go through those. The first is, for example, a sense direct perceiver apprehending in the distance a reddish color, which is in fact the color of fire, and with respect to which there is a doubt, wondering, is that the color of fire or not? I'll just read these and then we'll explain, or we'll talk about it. The second is, for example, a sense direct perceiver apprehending a tree having leaves and branches, which is in fact an Ashoka tree, and with respect to which there is a doubt, wondering, is that an Ashoka tree or not? And the third is, for example, a sense direct perceiver apprehending blue that induces a doubting consciousness that thinks, did I see blue or not? My first question I'll ask you guys just is, he said terminologically, right? So which of these is actually a valid cognizer when ascertainment is induced by another, and which of them is not? Anybody have a sense of that?
But if somebody later tells the person that it wasn't a Ashoka tree, then it would be a correct, valid cognition.
Yep. Yeah. So that would be right. So that one, if in other words, yeah, if later they learned that was an Ashoka tree, that would be an example. You're right. That is an example of a valid cognizer when ascertainment is induced by another. So that would be a correct example of that. And how about the first one, where the person sees the reddish color and thinks, so they validly cognize that's red, but they're thinking, oh, is that a fire? Is that red the color of fire? Is there fire there? And let's say they later walk closer and see that it's fire. Would that be an example of a valid cognizer when ascertainment is induced by another? Yeah, it would be, wouldn't it? Because in other words, they correctly had a valid cognition of red, but they weren't sure if it was fire, right? Like let's say they saw a flash of red and they couldn't tell, oh, is that a fire or is there a monk robe in the wind or something, and they walk closer and they saw, oh no, that's not a monk robe, there's a fire there, right? That would be, they had a first moment of valid cognition of red color. They wonder if it was fire, and then as they got closer, they had a valid cognition recognizing that it was indeed fire. So that would be a valid cognizer when ascertainment is induced by another, right? That would be another example that is that. Then the third one, now it's easy because we already said two, right? And we said it's terminological, but the third example where somebody saw blue and thought, was that blue or not? They had a sense direct perceiver apprehending blue. And part of the point here is that one thing I'll point out is if they're not sure it was blue, then even the initial one wasn't a valid, right? Like in other words, a valid cognizer knows its object. So if they're not sure it was blue, they didn't know the object initially. So it's not even a valid cognizer, so it can't be a valid cognizer when ascertainment is induced by another, because the initial cognition wasn't valid, because a valid cognizer knows its object. In this case, the person didn't know, they couldn't recognize the color. So they were kind of confused, right? That could happen, right? Is that blue or purple? They can't tell or something. But I want to clarify a point here just so it's clear, right? So the first one is clear, right? It's where you have a valid cognition of something, but you don't learn the truth about it until that was an example, you don't learn some truth about it until another consciousness realizes that. That was the example given, here is the example, is the color red and is it fire, right? But the example I gave earlier, if you meet somebody and you don't know their name and later you learn their name, that's an example of that one. Well, actually, that could be an example of the second here too, though. That's interesting. Actually, no, I'm wrong. That would be an example of the second. I just said the wrong thing. Because the second one is where there's ascertainment of the generality, but then this particular has to come. So the general, actually, I said the wrong thing, right? The generality here is tree, right? There is the person perceives something and recognizes, oh, it's a tree, but they don't yet know the specific, that it's a Ashoka tree, right? And through subsequent conceptual cognizer, obviously, they would realize that it's an Ashoka tree, right? So I have an example, like, so the example I gave earlier, when I first met Sujata, I knew she was a human being, so that would be the generality, right? But I didn't know the specific. I didn't know that she was Sujata yet. So that would be an example of the second, actually. Whereas the first example, the person recognized a reddish color, but they weren't having some generality. They weren't saying, so for example, if somebody saw a reddish color in the distance and knew it was clothes, oh, there's some item of clothes there. Is that a monk's robe or is that a woman's dress? Then it would be the second, right? But if they're just seeing redness and not categorizing it and they go closer and realize it's fire, then it's the first, right? So there's no generality. So that's the difference. And then it says, anyway, so then it pointed out that the last of the, here he's saying the last of the three is the example that's only terminological. It's not an actual example of a valid cognizer when ascertainment is induced by another. And then I'm going to summarize these last couple paragraphs and then raise an issue. I'm just going to summarize. So the last couple paragraphs, what they're really getting at is this. It's just an interesting point that the initial cognizer is a valid cognizer, right? So I'm going to use the example of red because that's the one Perpechoke uses. So the person sees red in the distance, and that's a valid cognizer, right? They saw red. So it's a valid cognizer with regards to red, but it's not yet a valid cognizer with regards to fire, right? But a subsequent, another, right? Another, in this case, a subsequent other, right? Induces ascertainment that it's fire, right? So they need more data, right? Or you need more data, or I need more data. We need, and then a subsequent cognizer induces ascertainment of a truth about that initial valid cognizer, is what they're getting at. I think you understand the concept here, but now I just want to, while we still have a few minutes, get into, so why is this relevant? Like, what's the relevance of this? Again, because you see where I started with that? You could get into the details here and go, okay, they're just having these, they're having interesting kind of terminological points about how we perceive, and then sometimes we have a valid cognition of something, but later. But and what I want to suggest is, first of all, like if you check your own perceptions, this happens all the time, right? I mean, I gave an example. You meet somebody, or you see there are examples in daily life. You see a bird, or you don't know what it is. You say, "Oh, that's a bird." Like I just had that recently, right? Shayla, my partner, is a naturalist, so they'll say, "Oh, I saw this yellow bird," and then she gets very curious, and then she'll find out, and she'll say, "Oh, that's a whatever," and she'll tell me the name of the bird. That would be an example of the second, right? The valid cognizer that I perceive the generality, but later through the power of her, I realize the specific. So that happens all the time. But what I wanted to raise, just to contemplate for a minute or two together, a few minutes together, is, so you say this right, like, I just want to ask you again to contemplate something together with me, if you're willing, which is, what are your valid cognizers? And then when is there an ascertainment induced by another? That you see the ascertain with this one, the valid cognizer, when ascertainment is induced by another, what he's getting at, what Perpechoke is getting at, is you have to have an initial valid cognizer, redness, right, a red color. And then you have a subsequent valid cognizer where you walk closer and you realize it's fire, right? So both of those are valid cognizers, and they realize something correct about the nature of an object. And I just want to ask you to think about something, right? Which is, how often in your life do you have a valid cognizer? Right? I'm going to give an example. I'm going to give an example that's a little more challenging for a second. Let's say I won't use political, I'll use personal. But let's say you know somebody, you close to somebody, a close friend or a loved one, a family member or something, and you have a valid cognition that their eyes are furrowed. You have a valid cognition that their voice sounds loud. You have a valid cognition that their face is like that or something, whatever, has a certain facial expression, right? So you have a valid cognizer, a visual valid cognizer, and actually, according to the one, the category from earlier, the previous section, right? So you can actually, the eye consciousness can perceive an angry facial expression, right, through familiarity. Actually, Paul Ekman's research would suggest that may be even inborn in us, the ability to perceive a facial, without labeling, we might be able to perceive, the eye consciousness itself might be able to perceive that, right? And the ear consciousness can perceive tone of voice. And then what happens? Right? And this is getting at what Sujata was raising about compounded phenomena. It's getting me to, I'm raising that, right? What happens is conceptual knowers kick in, right? And now you're going back and forth between direct perception, right? So of like voice and of, let's say in my example, of voice, sound, and of visual input. But then your conceptual knowers kick in, right? And here's the humongous challenge. Are those conceptual knowers valid cognizers when ascertainment is induced by another, or are they distorted? And how do you know? And this is the question, right? Like, this is a humongous question. That's actually a question for practice, isn't it? Like, and how do you differentiate? When am I having a valid cognition? You know, and what happens, isn't it, is that we make up stories. Oh, they're doing this. Oh, they're whatever. And do you see where do you see where this is going? Right? Like, actually, just last night I was having a conversation with Sheila about this topic. After I was reading it, and I remember this time. Actually, I'll just share a very brief story. I remember a time I was working on my. I think some of you might have heard this story. But I remember I was working on my dissertation, and I needed to get my degree in order to be able to work. So I was stressed out. And one of my dissertation committee members wasn't responding. Like, I kept reaching out to him. All the others had said, "This is great, you're fine, let's go forward." And he wasn't responding. And I was getting quite upset because I was like, I can't work and I'm not running out of money. And what am I going to do? And I was like, you know, I started making up this whole narrative, like he's being disrespectful. He promised to do this job and it's his job and he's not doing it. And I was getting, you know, upset. And I liked him. He was my professor. But I was getting upset. I almost kind of left him a kind of frustrated sounding message. And then I stopped and I thought about him and I actually did this. I thought, what's my valid cognition? And I thought, my valid cognition is he's not reaching out. My valid cognition is he usually isn't like this. My valid cognition is something's unusual. That's an inferential cognition. Something unusual is happening. Beyond that, I don't know anything. Luckily, I did that. You know, I stopped and I separated my narrative from what did I have a valid cognition about. And then I actually sent him a small gift with a letter saying, something's going on, something's unusual. How are you? You know, this is unusual. Usually you would reach out, but you're not. And he called me, I think he called me and he said, the section of your dissertation I'm up to is about death and my mother just died. I can't read it right now. I apologize. And I was like, you know, and I thought back to some of the narratives I made up, like he doesn't really care, or he's being selfish, or he's whatever it was. I can't remember now. But and my point is, like, there's a humongous benefit, right, to separating what do I have a valid cognition of and what is I don't have a valid cognition. I'm just making something up, right? And do you see how like that plays out? I just want to point out, right? I'm just giving a personal example because like that's how it plays out. It plays out, but that plays out in like families, right? It plays out in marriages. It plays out between friends. It plays out between coworkers. Right? I mean, as I think about this kind of thing, like, I mean, oh my gosh, I didn't think of this yesterday, but my work as a psychologist, right? Like so much of my time is spent like where people have a valid cognition that something happened, say at their job or wherever, you know, but then we all do this. You know, like somebody has a narrative about a narrative about what's happening that's not grounded in valid cognition yet, right? And oftentimes they're distorted. Mine are, everybody's are, you know, we all are. And what Buddhism's saying is check, right? So do you see the relevance of this? Like it could seem like an intellectual exercise. It's not. Oh my goodness, it's not, right? Like, and actually I'll just share, maybe I'll share one more personal example, but it's not about me. It's the opposite side. It's about, I remember once, now I understand it from a valid cognition perspective, this story, but I remember like we were at teachings by the Dalai Lama and I was with Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche and his other monks and entourage. And there was this hugely stressful situation about visas, and people were upset because like there was worry that, you know, there was a correct valid cognition that there was a problem between people about a visa decision. But then like individuals were worried about being deported from the country, right? Like, so people were quite upset. And there was an argument like between different people about like, what's going to happen? And this is terrible. And this person did this and this person did that. You know, and people were making up what we do as human beings, narratives. And Gyume Khenchen was one of the people who they were worried would be deported, right? So, I mean, you would think he would have a personal stake in it. But I remember them coming to Gyume Khenchen and saying, you know, what if they deport you? And what if they deport me? And Gyume Khenchen like just started laughing hysterically. Like he couldn't stop laughing. You know, like the people were having this argument and they were like, who's right and who's wrong? And Gyume Khenchen was like, you know, that kind of laughter where you can't breathe. He was like doubled over on the bed and he just couldn't stop. You could see he just couldn't stop laughing. And I was watching him and I was like, they're arguing partly about whether he'll have to leave the country, you know, and he sort of then, you know, kind of like, and they said, who's right and who's wrong? And he said, and he was laughing. And finally, when he could speak, he said, you're both wrong. He said, all of you are wrong. Or the two or three people who were arguing were wrong. And part of what he was saying was like, what he was saying was valid cognition. He was saying, yes, a letter was received. You know, that's a valid cognition. Yes, people are upset. That's a valid cognition. All the rest is not valid cognitions. You're making things up, right? Like, and I was like, wow, who can do that in a moment where, you know, their presence in a country is at stake or something? And that's the power of this teaching, though. Does that make sense? Like, he didn't get upset. Like everybody else was upset. I was upset. I remember, like, oh no, what if this happens? And the power of pramana teachings is you don't get upset by your made up stories, right? Because, you know, so that's, I mean, so these teachings are very profound. And you could say, well, what's this talking about? Like, you know, the generality, but not the particular, and so on. It's getting at really being precise about what do I know and what do I not know. Does that make sense? And like, because our minds confuse that so much, you know, and you know, and I often go to the extreme at this point, right? Like, but you know, whether it's people arguing like that, like friends arguing, or it's war, right? Like, it's caused by a lack of valid cognition. Yeah. You know, you can start to see it, right? All arguments, or maybe there's an exception. Nearly all arguments between people. I guess I'll say maybe there's some exception. I'm sure there could be, but you know, so many problems are caused by lack of valid cognition. Anyway, and remember, valid cognition, you know, it's both direct, you know, as Frank was asking, right? It's both direct perception, but it's also conceptual. Conceptual knowers can be, you know, inferential cognitions, and then there are the subsequent cognizers. And you know, the whole goal here now in this is to be clear with ourselves, right? To know your own mind, and that's what this is all about, right? Mind and awareness. So, make a final point here. So this teaching is on mind awareness, but it's actually about your own mind, right? So you're supposed to take these teachings and apply them back to yourself and say, what do I perceive validly? You know, and like right now I'm looking at Tanka of Lama Tsongkhapa, right? And I'm knowing that I know as I'm seeing colors, my eye conscious is seeing colors. But according to this teaching, right, conceptually it is Lama Tsongkhapa. Right? You know, that's who's painted in that Tanka. That's a valid cognizer, right? First there's a visual valid cognizer, then there's a conceptual knower. There's a valid, you know, it's valid. It says Lama Tsongkhapa. But how often are my perceptions not like that? Right? How often are my perceptions not actually perceptions? They're cognitions that are actually wrong consciousnesses, for example. Anyway, you get my point. So I just wanted to raise that, say that's the relevance of these. So my suggestion for like homework or something is to reflect on this in relation to your own experience. Because again, you know, I mean, it's great to know the details of these labels and lists and all that. If you don't memorize the list of the 5 or 6, whatever, you know, if you don't remember all 5 types of valid cognizers that induce ascertainment by themselves, okay, you know, it's not maybe the end of the world. It's not that big a deal. But what's really helpful is if you can catch, when am I, right? when am I having a valid cognizer and when am I just not having a valid cognizer? And if you can start to say, maybe when I'm not having a valid cognizer, maybe I'm wrong. That's really helpful for practice. So that's my suggestion for homework. It's just to ask yourself those questions if you're willing. But I guess we're supposed to stop. So let's do our dedication prayer. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chinrizik Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. The eye, which is merely labeled totally empty, empty from its own side, dedicates these merits, which are merely labeled totally empty from their own side, so that that merely labeled totally empty eye may achieve the Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled totally empty from its own side. In order to lead all sentient beings who are totally empty from their own side, merely labeled by the mind, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Thanks, everybody. See you next class. I know it's already scheduled, and Gabe put on the website the classes all the way into June. You know, we may add more or something. There are no classes in May because I'm going to probably be at teachings by Gyume Khenso Rinpoche in May or something. But if that changes, we'll add some. But anyway, at least there are classes up there now through March, April, and then June two classes. But keep an eye out if we have to change the May thing. But I'm hoping Gyume Khenso Rinpoche will be around. So then May we won't have class if that's true. So okay.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank
Thank
you
you
very
very
much.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, everyone.